In October 1907, thousands of desperate Americans stood shoulder to shoulder in the freezing street, screaming at locked bank doors as their entire life savings vanished into thin air. There was no warning, only a sudden, suffocating wave of terror as rumors spread that the vaults were empty. People who had worked tirelessly for decades suddenly realized that the money they had trusted to the system was simply gone. The panic moved like a plague through the financial district, turning respectable citizens into a frantic, crushing mob. Tellers pulled the shades down on the windows, hiding from the desperate faces pressed against the glass. This was not just a bad day in the markets, but the beginning of a total collapse that threatened to drag the entire country into ruin. The true nightmare of this moment was a chilling reality that is hard to imagine today. In 1907, there was no Federal Reserve, no central banking system, and absolutely no safety net to catch a falling nation. When a bank ran out of cash, it simply died, taking every penny of its depositors' money with it to the grave. Families faced absolute destitution with nowhere to turn for help. The national government in Washington was completely powerless to stop the bleeding, lacking both the funds and the authority to intervene in the crisis. The people were entirely on their own, staring into an economic abyss that promised to swallow their futures whole. With the federal government paralyzed and unable to print money to save the failing institutions, the survival of the American economy suddenly fell into the hands of private citizens. Out of this desperate void stepped one man who operated in the deep shadows of American finance, a man named J.P. Morgan. He was not an elected official or a public servant, but a private banker who possessed a level of immense, almost frightening power. Morgan controlled a vast network of railroads, steel mills, and financial institutions, holding the strings of the economy in his own hands. His personal wealth and influence were so staggering that they rivaled the resources of the United States government itself. When the panic struck, the deeply fractured banks realized that the only force strong enough to halt the collapse was the sheer will and deep pockets of Morgan. He became the unofficial central bank, a lone king dictating the survival of the nation from his private library. But the crisis that forced this solitary titan to seize control of the country did not happen by accident. The nightmare began with a dark, reckless plot orchestrated by a man named F. Augustus Heinze, who believed he could secretly manipulate the global price of copper. Operating in the shadows, Heinze borrowed massive sums of money to buy up millions of shares, attempting to corner the market and force his rivals into submission. It was a greedy gamble built entirely on borrowed time and stolen trust. When his scheme spectacularly failed, the price of copper collapsed, wiping out his fortune in a matter of hours. This catastrophic failure sent a violent shockwave of fear straight through the banks that had foolishly trusted him with their depositors' money. The sudden exposure of this massive hidden debt was the spark that ignited the devastating panic, sending terrified citizens running for the locked doors of their local branches. The toxic panic from the copper collapse swiftly infected the Knickerbocker Trust, one of the grandest and most trusted banks in New York City. The moment rumors of its instability hit the streets, a quiet dread transformed into outright hysteria. Working families, small business owners, and weary laborers abandoned their daily lives and sprinted toward the bank's massive stone columns. They were not wealthy investors playing a high-stakes game, but ordinary citizens desperate to rescue their life savings from vanishing into thin air. A terrifying scene unfolded on the pavement outside the Knickerbocker. Thousands of people crushed together in a sprawling, frantic line, begging clerks through iron grills just to hand them their own cash. Men wept openly, and women fainted in the suffocating crowd as the bank vaults were rapidly drained. When the heavy doors finally slammed shut, locking millions of dollars inside, the chilling reality set in that the money was gone, and there was no one coming to help them. The brutal collapse of the Knickerbocker Trust proved that the entire banking system was built on an illusion of safety, leaving the nation utterly defenseless against the spreading financial contagion. As the panic mutated into a nationwide catastrophe, the United States government realized it was entirely powerless to stop the bleeding. There was no central bank, no Federal Reserve, and no safety net to catch a falling economy. The Secretary of the Treasury hastily boarded a train to New York, stepping into a city paralyzed by fear and financial ruin. He surveyed the desperate crowds and the shuttered banks, confronting the crushing truth that the federal government lacked the funds and the authority to save its own citizens. In a shocking surrender of national power, the government made a chilling choice. The Treasury Secretary turned to the only force left standing, handing over millions in federal funds directly to J.P. Morgan. It was a profound admission of defeat, a moment where the elected leaders of a supposedly free nation bowed their heads and confessed they could not fix the disaster. The fate of the American economy was now entirely in the hands of one unelected, immensely wealthy man. With the government stepping aside, the immense machinery of national finance was handed over to a private citizen, fundamentally altering the balance of power in America. Retreating from the chaotic, screaming streets, J.P. Morgan orchestrated the survival of the nation from the heavy silence of his private library. Surrounded by rare books, ancient tapestries, and flickering firelight, the atmosphere was dark, quiet, and profoundly unsettling. Men of immense wealth and influence were forced to wait outside his heavy wooden doors, sweating and trembling like frightened children. Inside this opulent fortress, Morgan sat at his massive desk, holding the absolute power of life and death over the country's financial institutions. He played God with the economy, ruthlessly reviewing the ledgers of bleeding banks to decide their ultimate fate. With a single nod or a dismissive wave of his hand, Morgan chose which institutions would receive the cash needed to survive the night, and which would be left to wither and die. There was no appeal process, no democratic vote, and no mercy for those he deemed unworthy. The survival of thousands of ordinary depositors rested entirely on the cold, calculated judgment of a single private banker. But the terror was far from over, as the financial poison seeped directly into the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. The beating heart of American capitalism was suddenly running completely out of money to facilitate daily trades. Brokers frantically searched for cash to borrow, only to find the city vaults locked down tight by terrified bankers hoarding their remaining reserves. The cost to borrow money skyrocketed to unimaginable heights, creating a suffocating trap that threatened to bankrupt every major trading house in the city. A terrifying countdown to total economic death began ticking away. The president of the stock exchange rushed to Morgan's office with a grim warning that the exchange would be forced to shut down entirely within minutes. If the trading floor closed, the panic would instantly become a permanent, catastrophic depression, vaporizing whatever wealth remained in the country. It was a race against the clock, with the entire American financial system dangling over a bottomless abyss, waiting to see if Morgan would pull it back from the edge. The final seconds of that terrifying countdown at the stock exchange left a permanent scar on the nation's financial soul, proving that the entire economy could collapse in a single afternoon. The sheer speed of the near-death experience shattered any remaining illusion of safety. Everyone now knew that the invisible gears turning their world were fundamentally broken. John Pierpont Morgan did not react to this near collapse with panic, but with cold, calculated force. He summoned the city's top bank bosses to a hurried meeting, staring down the men who controlled the nation's wealth. He gave them a terrifying ultimatum, demanding they immediately hand over $25 million to keep the exchange afloat. The threat hanging in the air was absolute and unspoken. If these rival bankers refused to empty their own vaults within minutes, Morgan would simply step back and let the entire American financial system burn to the ground. He was forcing them to choose between instant surrender to his command or total ruin for everyone. But the ultimate display of his dark power came days later, on the shadowy night of November 2nd. The crisis had mutated, threatening a new group of financial institutions, and the usual methods of persuasion were no longer enough. Morgan realized he needed absolute control over the room to force a final, lasting solution. He invited the most powerful men in America to his private, cavernous library under the guise of a conference. Once the rival bankers were gathered among the towering bookshelves and rare artifacts, Morgan did the unthinkable. He ordered the heavy brass doors of the library locked from the outside, trapping the masters of the universe inside his personal fortress. Trapped behind those locked brass doors, the captive bankers realized they were now hostages to Morgan's financial dictation. The air in the room grew heavy as he presented them with a brutal mathematical reality. They had to pledge another massive sum to rescue a failing trust, and no one would be allowed to leave until the money was guaranteed. As the long, agonizing night dragged on, the psychological toll on the trapped men became unbearable. Exhausted, terrified, and broken by the sheer weight of Morgan's unyielding presence, their resistance slowly crumbled in the quiet shadows of the library. They were not just losing money, they were being stripped of their autonomy. When the sun finally came up, casting a pale light over the defeated room, the bankers surrendered completely. With trembling hands, they signed Morgan's paper, agreeing to fund his private bailouts and bowing to his absolute authority. The catastrophic panic was finally stopped, not by the laws of the land or the power of the government, but by the terrifying willpower of one single man. The immediate crisis was over, but a deep, Dark unease quickly settled over the entire country. Investigators and politicians began to piece together exactly how a private citizen had managed to bend the whole economy to his will. The ledgers and agreements signed in that library provided a paper trail of a shadow government operating outside of any democratic control. As the facts of the bailout became public, a chilling realization gripped the American public. People understood that if John Pierpont Morgan possessed the immense, unregulated power to single-handedly save the United States economy, he also held the exact same power to deliberately destroy it. The nation had survived the panic, but it had awakened to the terrifying vulnerability of being completely at the mercy of a billionaire's mood. The terrifying reality of that locked library door lingered long after the panic subsided, leaving a cold dread in the minds of anyone who understood what had just happened. The United States government was deeply spooked by the realization that a single citizen held more power than the entire national treasury. Lawmakers in Washington could no longer ignore the immense, shadowy influence of what people were now calling the money trust. They formed a special group known as the Pujo Committee with one simple, unprecedented goal. They were going to drag the secret financial networks of Wall Street out into the harsh light of day. The committee began pulling back the curtain on how a tiny handful of bankers controlled the lifeblood of the American economy. Investigators mapped out a massive web of corporate boards, silent partnerships, and hidden handshakes that all pointed back to Morgan. They showed exactly how a few men could choke off credit to an entire industry or save a favored friend from ruin, operating completely outside the reach of any law or elected official. Inside the cramped, smoke-filled hearing rooms of the Capitol, the sheer scale of this invisible empire was finally laid bare for the public to see. The chilling insight gained from these investigations was not just about corruption, but about a terrifying fragility. The country realized that relying on the private wealth and personal willpower of one aging billionaire to stop an economic collapse was a recipe for ultimate disaster. It was like depending on a single, cracking pillar to hold up the massive, heavy roof of a towering cathedral. If that one pillar gave out, or if Morgan simply chose not to act during the next crisis, the entire structure of American society would crush the millions of people standing beneath it. The sheer vulnerability of a nation that had to beg a private banker for its own survival was a wake-up call that could no longer be ignored. This profound, lingering fear forced a massive and permanent shift in how the nation managed its money. By 1913, the government signed the Federal Reserve Act into law, stripping the power of the ultimate bailout away from private individuals. They built a central banking system designed to act as the ultimate safety net, ensuring that the fate of the nation would never again be locked inside a Wall Street library. The era of the lone financial savior was officially dead, replaced by an institution built to protect the public from the very panics that Morgan had once controlled. Yet, for the countless families whose savings had already vanished into the void during the panic, this new safety net arrived years too late. Working people who had trusted their modest wages to neighborhood trusts were left with nothing but empty vaults and shattered futures. The lasting legacy of the crisis was etched into the lives of those ordinary citizens who spent decades trying to rebuild from the ruin. They became the silent, forgotten collateral damage of a financial system that had prioritized the survival of the powerful over the security of the vulnerable. The terrifying events of 1907 shattered a long-held American illusion. For decades, the nation operated on the belief that a free market could always correct itself without government interference. But the agonizing days when the entire economy rested in the hands of a single aging banker in a locked New York library proved that assumption fatally wrong. The sheer scale of the panic revealed that private wealth, no matter how vast, was no longer enough to protect a rapidly growing industrial society from total ruin. This brutal awakening forced a permanent, structural shift in how the country managed its money and its future. When the Federal Reserve Act was signed into law in Washington in December 1913, it marked the absolute end of an era. The government officially absorbed the responsibility of being the ultimate financial safety net, permanently stripping the power of the bailout away from secretive syndicates. The public had learned the hard way that the survival of their families, their farms, and their businesses could never again be left to the mercy of a few wealthy men negotiating in the shadows. Today, the heavy wooden doors of J.P. Morgan's private library still stand in quiet grandeur. Yet the ornate rooms and silent ledgers within no longer hold the power to dictate the survival of a nation. serving only as a haunting reminder of the terrifying moment when the fate of millions hung entirely on the whispered word of one man.